we were just talking about casualty numbers in the Ukraine war and what the New York Times has been reporting. This is the same as body counts, right? This is a body count argument. This is just like Vietnam. Very important to understand that. You pointed out, quite correctly, of course, that in the West, we often talk about the failure of the Russians to capture territory. And you say that that's not a good indicator when you're in a war of attrition. And that, of course, is true. And in a war of attrition, what matters is the casualty exchange ratio. And the casualty exchange ratio is effectively the same as body counts. So what you see going on here with this New York Times piece is very similar to what you saw with body counts in Vietnam. And the body count process in Vietnam was fundamentally dishonest. Very important to understand that. And the body count process in Ukraine, as we discussed about the New York Times article, is fundamentally dishonest. And it's exactly what you would expect. I want to make another point. Very important to understand that the Vietnam War and the Ukraine War were ground wars, or are ground wars, or is a ground war in the Ukraine case and was a ground war in the Vietnam case. I have to get my tenses right here. There were ground wars where armies were crashing into each other and huge numbers of people were dying. So body counts or casualty exchange ratios mattered. In the Gulf, in the Iran war today, there's no ground war. Remember that the initial part of the war from February 28th to April 8th was fought in the air. That was the air war from February 28th to April 8th. Then the air war ended. The bombing effectively ended, except for two minor blips later on we could talk about. But the air war basically ended, and we segued to a blockade. It was April 13th when we moved to a blockade. And the blockade ended when we signed the Memorandum of Understanding. That was June 17th. So we went from a bombing campaign to a blockade, and we never launched a ground offensive. And so there's no body count argument at play in the Iran war. It's a very different kind of conflict. And to be more specific about the Iran case, as everybody said, if you really wanted to achieve the goals that the Israelis and the Americans set out for themselves on February 28th, you would need boots on the ground. There's the ground option. And we were unwilling on February 28th, and at any point since then, to put boots on the ground, at least in any meaningful way. So we've never gone near that ground option, because when you go to the ground option, that's when you really suffer serious casualties. And when you suffer really serious casualties, it becomes much more difficult to justify the war. And that's why the body counts, the casualty exchange ratios attract so much attention.
So, no, I agree. But also, yeah, with Iran, you would have thought the US would have greater success, though. That is, it did stay away from the ground war, because as a naval power such as the United States, history suggests it should stay out of ground wars, be it Vietnam, Iraq, that this is not playing to America's strength. But in Iran, you had naval power, air power, so it should, I guess, have assumed the greater success on the American side. On the other hand, you can't really win a war with air power alone either. But how do you measure success in the war against Iran? On behalf of the Americans, that is, how would you measure progress? Because it's a very unique kind of war. Is it the destruction of ballistic missiles, offensive capabilities, defensive capabilities? Is it removing proxies or allies, be it Lebanon, Iraq, or Yemen? How would we know if the United States would be winning the war against Iran?
A couple of points. One is, we're not going to win the war. we're going to lose the war. But in the process of losing the war, we have two goals that we need to achieve. And if we come out of this in reasonably good shape, we will have achieved those two goals. But it's just very important to understand that Iran has won this war. Iran is going to emerge from this war much more powerful relative to its neighbors than it was on February 27th. America's position in the Gulf is going to be greatly weakened as a result of this war. But I want to get to your specific question because it is terribly important. We have two goals here. Putting aside the question whether we win or lose, we have two goals. Number one is to open the strait because we got to get oil flowing. And that will include Iranian oil, which we're allowing to come out of the strait. And we're allowing the Iranians to get paid in dollars for that oil, right? We're giving them a good deal because we want to flood the market with oil so that the economy, the international economy, doesn't go off a cliff. So goal number one was to open the strait, get the oil flowing. Goal number two is to get a nuclear deal. We have to get a nuclear deal. It's obviously going to be some variant of the JCPOA, but there has to be some sort of deal that limits what Iran can do in terms of developing nuclear weapons moving forward. You mentioned missiles. There's going to be no agreement on missiles. Some people might say, well, what about supporting Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? There's going to be no agreement there, right? The regime change, that was another one of our goals. There's not going to be regime change, not as a result, immediate result of this war, maybe in 2 or 3 or 4 years, who knows, but not now. The key issue is the nuclear issue. Now, it's very important to understand how the Memorandum of Understanding was structured. It was structured so that the shooting between, or the bombing between Iran and the United States would be shut down once the memorandum was signed. And number two, the strait would be opened and oil would flow out into world markets. Now, with regard to the bombings campaign stopped on April 8th. There was really nothing to stop. The bombing campaign ended and we went to a blockade. And we can't go back to a bombing campaign for a whole slew of different reasons, right? So that really didn't matter that much, except maybe in Lebanon. But let's leave Lebanon aside. The key issue to start with that we cared about was opening the strait. And the strait is now opened for all intents and purposes. Not fully open, but it appears that it may be fully opened. And if it isn't, we're in real trouble. But that was the least difficult goal to achieve because the Iranians have a vested interest in selling their oil. Okay. The big number two goal that's sitting out there is the nuclear issue. And that is yet to be resolved. What you want to understand here is we now have to deal with the nuclear issue side by side with 4 big economic issues that would all be advantage Iran. One is reparations. 2 is the frozen assets. 3 is lifting the sanctions. And 4 is the question of the toll booth in the strait. In other words, these issues have not been resolved. Just think about it. That $300 billion fund for reparations, not settled yet. Lifting all the sanctions, not settled yet. Releasing all the frozen assets. I guess there are probably over $100 billion in frozen assets. Unfreezing all of them. And then the toll booth issue. Okay, they have to be resolved, those issues. And the nuclear issue has to be resolved, right? So we have solved the problem of opening the straits for the most part in the beginning. And now we have all those other big issues staring us in the face. And I would just say to you, if we don't get a deal, we meaning the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, we don't get a deal on the nuclear issue, we're going to be in real trouble. Because as you well know, the Iranians have the capability to quite easily build a bomb. And if we don't have something like a revised version of the JCPOA, what's going to stop them from building a bomb? So there's going to be very powerful incentives on us to get that deal, which means that we're likely to have to make major concessions to the Iranians on those 4 big economic issues that the Iranians care about. So there's a lot of negotiation to be done. And it just seems to me, if we're going to be successful, we've got to keep the strait open, number one. And number two, we got to get a nuclear deal.
Well, if those were the only 2 objectives, that is a nuclear deal and get the oil flowing, it would be achievable because, well, the Iranians weren't pursuing nuclear weapons before this war, and oil was flowing before the war as well. But as you said, there's a new objectives now. The MOU makes it very clear there's no going back to the old status quo. So the Iranians, I think they're worried as well because on one hand, it's hard to imagine the US implementing all the things it signed under with the MOU, that is ending all sanctions, getting Congress on board, giving $300 billion in reparations, accepting the toll booth or fee or whatever one wants to refer to it. It's very hard to see this being acceptable. At the same time, there's no good military option unless, Israel might be able to instigate a civil war in Lebanon, or the US could pressure Iraqi government to shut down some Iranian militant groups. I mean, one could go after allies, but it doesn't look like that's a viable strategy for military success. So I'm just, what do you think the strategy is here? Will they take a horrible peace deal, or will they take a non-existent military option, or how are you assessing what's likely based on American strategy here, or how you see the strategy at least?
Well, this is a great question. Let's just talk this through. First of all, there's no military option, as you and I know. And one reason there's no military option is that if you go back to bombing, the strait will be closed again. We can't do anything that allows the strait to be closed again. That we just got it open, and we want to keep it open. And for all these people who are talking about, let's go back and finish the job. What are they talking about? We had a 40-day bombing campaign. It didn't work. That's why we ended it on April 8th. And furthermore, we were running out of munitions. And furthermore, the Iranians have a second strike capability. And furthermore, they can really crash the world economy. So what are people talking about? We don't have a military option. We got the strait open. And now the question is, are we going to deal with the nuclear issue? You're saying, Glenn, I think quite correctly, I'm not disagreeing with you, that it's hard to imagine the Americans making those concessions that I described on what I called the 4 big economic issues. Okay? Again, the whole question of the toll booth, releasing all those frozen assets, all those complete sanctions relief, and the $300 billion reparations fund. Can you really see the United States conceding on all those issues? I mean, the end result would be that Iran would be in excellent shape moving forward. This is a country with 93 million people. You get its economy back on its feet. It's in a position where it dominates the Persian Gulf. It controls the Strait of Hormuz. Iran would be really quite powerful. Is America going to let this happen? That's the question you're asking. Okay. The counter to that, Glenn, is what about the nuclear issue? the Iranians are going to play hardball with us. We know that. They're going to say, if you don't dance to our tune on the economic issues, no nuclear deal. What are we going to do then? No nuclear deal? I don't know about that. We got to get a nuclear deal, I think. But if we don't get a nuclear deal, we're going to be in real trouble because there is a really good chance that they'll get nuclear weapons or they'll move in that direction. And this will cause the Israelis to think about using their nuclear weapons, Israeli nuclear weapons, against Iran. So the potential for disaster here. So we have a very powerful incentive to get a nuclear deal. Trump has a very powerful incentive to put this behind us. Just to come at this from a slightly different angle. You understand that the Iranians wanted to deal with the nuclear issue up front. Remember, I described the Memorandum of Understanding as dealing first with opening the strait, ending the shooting, that's one, and then later dealing with the nuclear issue and those big economic issues, okay? The Iranians were smart. They put the nuclear issue at the rear end of the negotiations because they knew it would give them huge leverage down the road. If they negotiated the nuclear deal and the strait deal now, right, and then later they moved to the economic issues, they'd have no leverage. The only thing that gives them leverage, they no longer have leverage because they control the strait, because they've opened the strait. Their leverage now rests with the nuclear issue. They were smart to keep the nuclear issue until the end. So they have a lot of leverage over us, and we have a vested interest in caving to them, fulfilling the various agreements that make up the Memorandum of Understanding. But maybe that won't happen. But the end result is we won't get a nuclear deal.
Well, let me just ask one final question, though. If we take a few steps backwards to get see a larger picture, how would you define the American grand strategy now at this point in history? That is, during the Cold War, the grand strategy with, one rival, one other center of power with one competing ideology. It was, the grand strategy of containment and all the other components. It set a clear goal, which kind of brought more or less the whole political class together. All other strategies were kind of had to be subordinated to this wider grand strategy. What is it today? Well, how is the United States dealing with the massive changes in the world and its own role in this world? That's a large question for, but...
Well, I think when me and my friends, or my friends and I, thought about grand strategy over the decades, we always used to argue that obviously the Western Hemisphere is the most important area of the world for the United States, but given that the United States is a regional hegemon, there's no serious threats in the Western Hemisphere. The question is, what are the areas outside of the United States that matter the most from a strategic point of view? Where are our vital interests at play around the world? And I think most people in my circle agreed that the three areas that mattered the most were Europe, East Asia, because there were great powers in Europe and East Asia, and the Persian Gulf, because oil was there. Those were the three key areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere. And during the Cold War, we focused mainly on Europe because the Soviet threat was centered in Europe. But the Soviet Union was, and Russia is, physically located in East Asia, as we both know. So we cared about containing the Soviets not just in Europe, but in East Asia as well. And the Persian Gulf was the area where we had to do the least amount of work. The British did the heavy lifting in the Gulf up until 1968. And then after 1968, up to 1979, we depended on the Iranians. This is under the Shah, the Saudis, and we didn't have any great threat. After 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and there was the revolution in Iran, and Iran was no longer an ally, we built the Rapid Deployment Force, which was an over-the-horizon capability. In other words, we were not physically located with military forces, or we didn't have many military forces physically located in the Gulf. We had this Rapid Deployment Force, which again was over the horizon. So you see that during the Cold War, we cared about Europe, we cared about East Asia, and we cared about the Gulf. Then comes the multipolar world that we're now in. And China is the principal threat to the United States, and therefore we pivoted to Asia. And there was a lot of talk about pivoting away from Europe and minimizing our commitment to the Gulf, because we didn't see any great problem in the Gulf. We thought we had things under control. And with regard to the Western Hemisphere, things were pretty good in the Western Hemisphere. No serious threats to the United States. Along comes the Trump administration, back into the White House, January 2025. What you see is that President Trump decides to make the Western Hemisphere a high priority. And we're deeply involved in social engineering and military engagement in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at what's happening in Venezuela, if you look at what's happening with regard to Cuba, if you look at President Trump's rhetoric about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state, the United States is paying a lot of attention to the Western Hemisphere, which kind of befuddles me because I don't think we face any serious threats at this point in time in the Western Hemisphere. But nevertheless, we are deeply involved in doing social engineering and even maybe acquiring territory in the Western Hemisphere. You want to remember that President Trump said at the time when we captured President Maduro of Venezuela, that the United States now, or he now runs Venezuela, and that he basically viewed Venezuelan oil as American oil. It's really quite remarkable. So you can see that we're on the march in certain ways in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to the Gulf, we're now involved in a major conflict with Iran. It's really quite amazing. One can make the argument, Glenn, that we will eventually leave the Gulf, that we can no longer maintain military bases there. Our alliance structure is in tatters. That may happen. But for the time being, if you look at American grand strategy, we are up to our eyeballs in alligators in the Persian Gulf. And as I said, we're deeply involved in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to Ukraine and Europe, as we talked about earlier in the show, it appears that President Trump is more or less re-engaging in Ukraine, getting more deeply involved. And one could argue, Glenn, as the tide turns against Ukraine, which you and I know is happening as we speak, that the Americans will feel compelled to move in and do everything possible to rescue Ukraine so as not to suffer a humiliating defeat. And then there's East Asia. That is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. So we're not leaving East Asia. And if you look at what the Chinese are likely to do over time and what the Americans are likely to do over time, that's a dangerous area of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now or even 5 years from now, when you and I are talking about all the problems in the world, that China is not at the top of the list. So all of this is to say that the United States, under President Trump, has a remarkably ambitious grand strategy. Think about what I said about the Western Hemisphere. Think about where we are in the Gulf. Think about where we are vis-a-vis Ukraine. And think about the pacing threat, China. We don't seem to believe in the word prioritizing. The United States still labors under the illusion that it can be everywhere and do everything all the time. And I think that's where American grand strategy is at the moment. I think we could have a long conversation, and we should do this the next time we talk, or maybe do it the next time we talk, about where American grand strategy is headed. Once these various conflicts are behind us or they sort themselves out. And here we're talking about Ukraine and Iran, and also to some extent places like Cuba and Greenland. Then we can maybe get a clearer picture of American grand strategy. But I do think, Glenn, we, the United States, are going to have to learn to prioritize. I think this idea that, we can maintain this militarized state that's involved in really deep-seated ways in all four of these regions is not workable over the long term.
No, that's what I thought was the main challenge to the United States at this time in history, though, that is, as transition from unipolarity, where essentially it has a final say in every corner of the world, to multipolarity. The grand strategy would have to include priorities. That is, you can't be everywhere, then what comes first? And this, I don't want to belittle the politicians. I think this is a difficult thing to adjust to once you had a political culture over decades of being everywhere at the same time and embracing an ideology which makes it almost treasonous and, uncaring not to be everywhere, because all our wars is, of course, sold as being about, helping helping the disenfranchised and advancing liberal democracy. So it's very difficult to make this shift. But I thought that was the lesson from the Iran war, though. That is, if you can't have, when all the weapons had been spent in Ukraine, and then suddenly, how are we going to fight the Iranians? Then have to take the weapons from the Europeans, from the Ukrainians, from the East Asians, and send it all, not just to the Middle East, but Israel, because even the Gulf states were robbed of some of their air defenses. So I thought this was the main lesson. If you prioritize everything, you're not prioritizing anything at all. And but again, it could be, huge shifts in the international distribution of power. It's usually destabilizing because politicians, they do need time to adjust to new realities, I think. Anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we end the video?
Yeah, let me make two quick points. One is the debt problem.
I sorry to interrupt, but I always look at the debtclock.org, and I'm not even American. It's still depressing to me. It's a horrific number. So yeah, sorry. Go on.
No, you're right. It's you sort of think the chickens are going to come home to roost on that problem at some point in time. Second thing is, Glenn, if you look at the Ukraine war, and you think about fighting a war against China, or you think about fighting a war anywhere, what's very clear is that you need a large industrial base, and you need the capability to produce huge numbers of weapons. Again, just to go back to the Iran war, we had to quit after 40 days because we were basically running out of weaponry. It's truly amazing the extent to which we have run down our inventories of like Tomahawk missiles, Patriot missiles, THAAD missiles, air-to-ground smart bombs, and so forth and so on. Really quite amazing. And it's also quite amazing how long it's going to take us to rebuild those inventories, which have been whittled down. And what this tells you is that we are going to have to prioritize. If you're going to plan for a war in Asia, right, and you're thinking about how you deal with the Chinese in a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, a war that's going to go on for many months. Now, let's hope this never happens. I'm not saying this is likely or it's going to happen, but the Americans are going to have to prepare for a long war. This is what the Ukraine war has taught us. And we don't have the manufacturing base. When you look at how long it's going to take us to replenish our depleted stocks from the Iran war, it's really genuinely frightening from a security point of view. Really, it's quite amazing. So I think when you look at the debt problem and you look at the weakness of the American manufacturing base and the need to build a a large-scale inventory of weapons and to have the ability to produce weapons once the conflict starts. We have a lot of work cut out for us, and that's going to involve prioritizing. So I think that the events that are now taking place, let me put it slightly differently, the events that have taken place since the Ukraine war started in 2022 up to the present day, this 5-year period is a period in which we have, or maybe it's a 4-year period, is a period in which we have learned a lot. And what we have learned should leave us deeply worried about our future. And when I say our, I'm talking here about the U.S.